and welcome to Business Studies class. My name is Tarila Ohia, and today I'm taking you on divisions of commerce. I'm sure you're wondering, what's divisions of commerce? It simply means parts of commerce. Now, just like you can take an orange and cut it, divide it into parts, commerce can also be divided into parts. Now, in our previous lesson on the introduction to commerce, we said that commerce is simply trade and aids to trade. And of course, we know that trade is buying and selling. Aids to trade includes warehousing, transportation, insurance, advertising, banking, and communication. And these services support trade. They make buying and selling easy. Now we'll take them one at a time. Trade. In fact, in this lesson, we'll basically focus on trade. And some other time we'll learn on the aids to trade. Trade is the exchange of goods and services. And of course, as we know, trade is basically buying and selling. Trade can be divided into two types: home trade and foreign trade. Now, home trade can also be called domestic trade or internal trade. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what does this mean? These words are quite similar. Now, when we talk about home trade, what comes to mind? Home, a place where we live in, a place we dwell in. And when you think of the word domestic, what comes to mind? Something related to the home or something that originates from the home. For example, I'm sure you've heard of domestic animals, like the pets you have at home. Domestic, they're animals within the home. And then we have internal. Internal means inside. And with respect to trade, we're talking about inside the country. Now, I'm sure when I said home, you were thinking of your daddy's house where you live. But when we're talking about trade now, we're talking about the country. So home trade is basically buying and selling within a country. Buying and selling goods that are related to the home, which is a country. Buying and selling goods inside a particular country. Now, this is a situation in which both the buyer and seller are in the same country. Foreign trade. Now, unlike home trade, in foreign trade, both the buyer and seller are not in the same country. Let's look at the word foreign. Just like home trade, foreign trade has other names. It can be called international trade or external trade. Foreign, something outside the country. International, something that has to do with more than one country. Something between a country and another or among countries. And external means something outside. Not inside the country, but outside. So if we're not inside this country, we're outside this country. So you can have a country like Nigeria and another country that is outside Nigeria, for example, Ghana. So when we talk about foreign trade, we talk about buying and selling that involves more than one country. Take a look at this picture. Now, this is a woman in the market, and there are sellers here. She's a buyer. She's in the same market where the seller is as a buyer. This is an example of home trade. Of course, foreign trade has to do with other countries, not just one country. So you might have services such as warehousing. Remember the aids to trade we talked about that support trade to make it possible. You have transportation systems to aid trade. We can take a look at some of the things here. These are items that are gotten from different parts of the country and outside the country. Now let's take them one by one. Home trade. Home trade can be broken into wholesale trade and retail trade. Wholesale basically means bulk supply. It involves buying and selling in large quantities. Retail trade, on the other hand, involves buying and selling in smaller quantities. Now let's take a look at them clearly. Now producers like to make their goods in large quantities. They also like to sell them in large quantities. And they do this basically for two reasons. They want to reduce the cost of making the goods. On the other hand, they want to increase their profits when they sell at a good price. So they like to make and sell goods in large quantities. But you and I know that not everyone can buy in large quantities. Take for example, you want water because you're thirsty, you want to drink water. You don't necessarily have to go and buy a large quantity of cartons of water. You just probably go to a shop or a kiosk and you just get a bottle of water. So what happens? A group of sellers go to the producer and they buy in large quantities. But you know, they don't just buy these goods for themselves. They really don't need them. They buy them so that they can resell them. Now, this group of sellers who buy goods from producers in large quantities to resell them are known as wholesalers. Now, but the thing about the wholesalers is that even though they buy from the producers to resell, they also don't sell at quantities that you and I really need. They still sell at quantities that, even though are smaller, still pretty large. So then another group of sellers go to the wholesalers to buy goods. Now, of course, they are buying a bit smaller goods, but then they don't buy them because they need them. They buy them to resell them. And this time they resell them to consumers like you and I who need them. Now, this group of sellers who buy goods in smaller quantities to resell them to consumers like you and I are known as retailers. They are retailers. So from producers, goods are sold to wholesalers, and wholesalers resell to retailers. Retailers sell to consumers like you and I. Now take a look at the images we have here. This is a factory where bottled water is produced. Now the producer, as you can see, produces in large quantity and he sells them to a wholesaler who's willing to buy in bulk quantity. Now the wholesaler, because he buys in bulk quantity, he can't just take all of it to the market. So he stores it in a place. Now, do you remember what we call the place where goods are stored until they are needed in the market? The warehouse. So the wholesaler stores the goods in the warehouse. Can we see this? Cartons of water, still in large quantity, until a retailer comes to the wholesaler, like we have here, and buys the water in smaller quantity. Now he buys the bottled water in smaller quantities, but of course the retailer sells in quantities that are yet smaller, such as we need. Take a look at this. Now this is a retail shop. A retail shop is basically a shop where goods are sold in smaller quantities. And here we have a buyer who may just want to buy the bottles of water like we see here. A kiosk is also an example of a retail shop. I'm sure you have one around you, or at least you've seen one. Now we'll go to foreign trade. Remember, we said foreign trade has to do with buying and selling amongst countries or between countries. Now, foreign trade can be divided or broken into exports and imports. What are exports? They're basically goods and services that are sold to other countries. Goods, for example, in Nigeria, that are sold to other countries, for example, Japan. Imports, on the other hand, are goods and services that are bought from other countries. Goods bought from, for example, Nigeria is buying goods from Japan. Now, those goods and services are referred to as imports. I'm sure you're wondering, goods, which goods do we have in Nigeria that we sell out? Of course, Nigeria is rich in resources, but it can't produce all that it needs. So, it sells the one it has, and in return, it also buys. Some of the goods that Nigeria sells to other countries: cocoa, like we can see here, we have an image of cocoa, rubber, leather, crude oil. We have an example here. Of course, we said crude oil is transported through pipelines. Remember when we discussed transportation? And then we have coal, cotton, palm kernel, charcoal. Palm kernel, we have a sample here. These are palm kernels. Those of you that love to eat banga soup, if you know how it's prepared, it starts with the palm kernel. And then you have cassava. Now, these are just a few of the goods that Nigeria gets to sell out, which means there are many other goods that Nigeria could sell out to other countries. Now, like I said, Nigeria also buys goods from other countries. So some of the imports, the goods that we buy from other countries, include cars, car parts. Now here I have an image of cars. If you're like me, I'm sure you'll be looking at the good cars we have on the roads. Now, some of them are examples of the cars that are imported. Car parts, such as the car engine, maybe the dashboard, the doors. You know that the mechanics, usually when people have bad cars and they go to the mechanic, sometimes the mechanic needs to change a part. For example, maybe the engine. Such parts are imported into the country. They are bought by Nigeria from other countries. We have GSM phones, like we can see here. There's a mobile handset there. Computers, like we have here. Washing machines. There's a sample here. Rugs, carpets, food, and beverages. Now, like I said, these are just a few examples, which means that many other things that can be bought from other countries. We've come to the end, but let's take a quick summary of all we've learned today. Commerce is divided into trade and aids to trade. Trade can either be home trade or foreign trade. Home trade, we say, can also be called domestic trade or internal trade. And this is trade that is within the country. The buyer and seller are both in the country. And of course, home trade can be divided into wholesale and retail trade. Wholesale trade, we said, involves buying in large quantities, but of course, to resell. Don't forget, the wholesaler is the one who resells the quantity. And then, of course, retail trade. Retail trade, we said, involves buying in smaller quantities to resell to consumers. And who did we say is responsible for this? The retailer. We also learned that foreign trade is also called international trade or external trade. It is trade that involves two or more countries, and it can be divided into export and import. Now, some examples we gave of exports, Nigerian exports now to other countries, are cocoa, rubber, cassava, crude oil, palm kernel, and of course many others. And of course, Nigeria buys other goods which we know as are known as imports, and they include cars and car parts, food and beverages, computers mobile phones, and all sorts. I'm sure you had a good lesson today. Well, I enjoyed teaching you. So I look forward to seeing you in the next class. Thank you.